Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford, and my co-conveners, Tong Ping and Barnaby Powell. This is the third of our series of Zooms on China and the West cultural dialogues. This is a series of talks and discussions in an overall Georgetown University initiative, the Future of the Humanities Project, which is run in partnership with Campion Hall and Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. We hope the project will bring people together through the promotion of the arts and humanities. The aims of this particular series on China are which is in cooperation with SACU, which is the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding in London, is to explore the history, culture, and traditions of China and to look for comparisons in Western society. Through them, we hope that we will increase our knowledge of the rich cultures of both East and West. Our audience is composed of students from the USA, UK, together with Chinese, British, and American scholars, as well as members of the general public. Our guest speaker, Alexa, will firstly give a talk for approximately 30 minutes, in which she will be looking at the influence of Shakespeare on China and Chinese responses. Barnaby Powell from SACU and I will then discuss the paper and bring in questions from our audience. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. You can do so from the start of the talk, and we do encourage you to do so as early as possible so that we don't get a bottleneck at the end of the talk and some questions fall off. Let me now introduce Tong Ping, one of my conveners for the series, who is originally from Chengdu, and she is here to introduce today's speaker. So over to you, Tong Ping.
Next, Alice Jubin writes about race, gender, and globalization. She teaches in several departments at Georgetown University, including English, theater, East Asian languages, and literatures. She is also the founding co-director of the Digital Humanities Institute. Today's talk is based on her latest book, Shakespeare and East Asia, which was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. The book asks an important question: how might we decolonize hegemonic knowledge production about East Asia and its relationship with the West? In particular, she will focus on China and the Sinophone world. What does Chinese embodiment of a white canon do? How might it change our understanding of China and the West? Now over to you, Alexa.
What's in a name? That which we call a rose by an Asian name would smell as sweet or not. While the play Romeo and Juliet is propelled by the generations-old dispute between the aristocratic Montague and Capulet, the Singaporean film Chicken Rice War, as you can see here, reduces the feud to the rivalry between the Wong and Chan families, who own competing chicken rice stalls next to each other in an open-air food court in Singapore. No blood is spilled other than that of poultry. Languages and accents are important markers of racial identities in this multilingual film. But this is only one of the many fascinating examples of Sinophone engagement with what is perhaps the most canonical of Western classics, Shakespeare. Welcome, everyone. Good morning and good evening. Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to Professor Scott and Professor Powell for inviting me. I wish to thank Tong Ping as well for the wonderful introduction. I'm grateful to Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, and the China and the West Cultural Dialogue series at Georgetown for co-hosting today's event. I would like to begin with a few words about my book's implication for the study of cultural exchange. My goal is to expand the purview of post-colonial studies, which tends to focus on British colonialism and Anglophone colonies, countries that do not fully align with the narrowly defined colonial experience, such as China and Taiwan, have been neglected. I wish to decolonize the study of non-Western cultures and of the Western canon. It is, in fact, racist to regard non-Western films as merely footnotes to the white canon and the white theory. My research reveals deep connections among various works that at first blush would seem to be disconnected. Since the 19th century, stage and film directors have mounted hundreds of adaptations of Shakespeare drawn on East Asian motifs. And by the late 20th century, Shakespeare had become one of the most frequently performed playwrights in East Asia. There are a number of fascinating aspects about Sinophone performances. So I'm going to begin my slide so that you can follow more easily. And as you can see here, there are 4 parts of my book, starting with formalistic concerns in chapter 1, moving on to the politics of reparation, how directors use Shakespeare for socially reparative purposes, to the question of reception, and eventually multilingual performances. So chapter 2, the politics of remediation, focuses especially on China and the Sinophone world, and that's the topic today. So there are 4 themes, and the first, as I've hinted at, is actually reparation. But not all directors treat this theme with a straight face. Some actually don't agree, and so they produce parodies of the idea of reparation. Namely, can engaging with literary canons make you a better person, make our society better? Some adaptations offer a corrective to Shakespeare's plays, such as Sherwood Hu's Hamlet, set in Tibet. And this film is called Prince of the Himalayas, which came out in 2006. Shot and filmed in Tibet with a Tibetan cast speaking Tibetan. The film gives Ophelia, as you see on the screen here, a more active role through a remedial view of the dramatic action, whereas Shakespeare's Gertrude's account of Ophelia recast her as a, quote, mermaid-like fairy tale creature. The Ophelia in Prince of the Himalayas is a goddess of nature, an immortal bride who returns to nature. The film still here shows the scene that pays tribute to pre-Raphaelite painter Sir John Everett Millet's Ophelia. Other works mock the conviction that Shakespeare has any recuperative function in a society, such as the Hong Kong comedy film One Husband Too Many, directed by Anthony Chang, 1988. While the canonical status of Shakespeare's oeuvre has led to admiration and deference, there have been many witty parodies of the tragedy since the 1980s. The film dramatizes its characters' near quixotic insistence on performing and rehearsing Romeo and Juliet to ameliorate their conditions. Shin pins his hope on bringing Western cultures to a backwater village by staging his version of Romeo and Juliet with the costumes and a soundtrack borrowed from Franco Zeffirelli's 1968 film. As you will see soon in the clip that I'll show, he takes on the role of Romeo. His wife plays Juliet. The first clip here would give you an idea of how this film parodies the idea of social reparation, the socially reparative function of literature.
是咧创啥哈？大概是想要放就放袂出来，徛尾啦。
神啊，你夺去他冰糖一样的呼吸，他的体温，他的美貌，他的笑容。话题在有，月照泪影，情不在心，万般无情，面对绝境，心痛莫名。我独留名，命笔 的凋谢。
丢你个头啊！
为你，我愿到阴间当壮丁。神啊！
我仍然在黑布袋一般的地狱吗？冰冻的罗密欧啊，你要我脱下这贵族的丑恶外衣，温暖你的胸膛吗？
有好戏看嘞！
你为我而殉情，我该怎么办？我该怎么办呢？
阿健，慢他了，慢点了，快点了，慢点了，慢点了！
The couple escapes backstage only to be reassured by the mayor that he will send his henchmen to safeguard the stage. And so they return to stage to try to finish up that final scene. There's never really a closure. So they're going to finally present the final scene of Romeo and Juliet, right, in the tomb, except they are interrupted again. And the linguistic landscape is quite rich. In the beginning, we hear the audiences using Southern Min dialect, and there's also a mix of Cantonese while they're performing in standard Mandarin. So the mayor's henchmen, they stand downstage, they tell the audiences to be quiet. In fact, when the audiences are too quiet, they tell them to applaud. You can't be so quiet. And they get into a brawl with the audience, the villagers. Oops, just a sec here.
Hey! 是阿仔，你当我是阿仔，这不是你起笑的所在啦！
刘大便，你是不给巴斯公面子！
刘大便，刘大便是你叫的，你还要小便呢？啊！不要这样嘛！现在演的是罗密欧与朱丽叶，又不是演仙桃牌通乳丸对四物丸。我只是想把。
Perhaps the audiences understand all too well that Romeo and Juliet really is not a love story, but actually a story about gang violence. And so they storm the stage and eventually take everything down. And this film is therefore a good example of parodic approaches to Shakespearean reparation. The director clearly doesn't believe in Western culture's ability to repair the cultural politics of a place like Hong Kong. But they're not unique. Politicians, they love to use the classics. They love to quote the classics. Chinese politicians have used Shakespeare for all sorts of reparative purposes, inspired by Karl Marx's frequent use of literary classics. Leaders of the People's Republic of China have repeatedly repurposed quotes from Shakespeare for politically expedient reasons, especially with regard to Sino-British relations. On June 26, 2011, during a 3-day visit to Britain, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao visited the birthplace of Shakespeare. He alluded to his boyhood love of Shakespeare in his speech to British Prime Minister David Cameron. In a moment when international economic relations and political capital were at stake, British Culture Secretary Jeremy Hunt was quite blunt. He said, I was hoping that 1 billion Chinese might see some pictures on TV of their premier coming and visiting the birthplace of Shakespeare and flock to Britain in droves. During Chinese President Xi Jinping's 2015 state visit to Britain, he quoted The Tempest. What is past is prologue, he says. He quoted this to the House of Parliament and urged the two countries to join hands and move forward in a reciprocal gesture. Queen Elizabeth II gifted Xi a special collection of the sonnets. Both the British and Chinese leaders appropriated Shakespeare's cultural capital for their own purposes, political politically reparative merits and economic returns, in this case, became the primary function of art. With the sonnets, Elizabeth reminded she of Britain's superior and often dominant cultural position. She used references to Shakespeare to project an image of a cosmopolitan China. Both sides saw Shakespeare as providing some common ground. Interestingly, she's quotation of Antonio's phrase, "What's past is prologue," from The Tempest, actually could perform double and conflicting duties. As you can see on the slide here, this is a photo of the National Archive in Washington, D.C. And you can see the famous phrase is actually engraved by the entrance. On one hand, the phrase implies that China and Britain will overlook their ideological differences and work together, despite the antagonistic history between them, right? A history that includes the Opium Wars and more recently, the Chinese government's treatment of the activist artist Ai Weiwei's human rights themed art. On the other hand, this phrase could betray Xi's thirst for power domestically and internationally, as indicated in China's One Belt, One Road initiative. As the tone changes, the phrase could carry more sinister meanings of a threat, hinting at escalating the conflict. What's past this prologue would mean you haven't seen anything yet. The phrase has frequently been misquoted in the first sense, actually. So here in the picture, the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., this phrase here is assumed to suggest the ways history shapes the present, or that history can help shed light on the present. Theater directors have drawn on the remedial effects of art on performance traditions and personal identities. Psychological realism as well. In the Sinophone world, they often draw on perhaps the superficial meanings of phrases like this without actually digging down to look at the potentially disruptive meanings of these out of context quotes. So to conclude our little section on reparative Shakespeare, in the Sinophone world and in China, which play is most reparative, you might ask? King Lear is the answer. King Lear holds a very special place in China and the Sinophone world because of its domestic politics, as well as the theme of filial piety. That's largely how it has been interpreted by Chinese-speaking artists. Now, there are numerous examples. On the screen here is a bilingual production by Hong Kong British director David Tse-Ka-shing. And this Mandarin English version of Lear was staged in 2006 in Shanghai and then in Stratford-upon-Avon by Tse's London-based Yellow Earth Theatre in collaboration with Shanghai Dramatic Arts Center in Shanghai. Focusing on the question of heritage and filial piety, this adaptation was actually set in Shanghai in 2020. And it framed the different worldviews of Lear and his daughter Cordelia in terms of linguistic difference, as is examined here. Lear is a business tycoon. He solicits declaration of love from his three daughters, Regan and Goneril, who live in Shanghai and are fluent in Chinese. They have no problem flattering their father. Cordelia, who lives in London, is unable to communicate in Chinese with her father. Her silence is both a result of her inability to speak Mandarin and a gesture of resistance of the patriarchy. Cordelia is a member of the Chinese diaspora in London. She participates in this important family and business meeting via video link. Ironically, but perhaps fittingly, the only Chinese word at her disposal is "mayo," meaning nothing. Similarly, Singaporean director Ong Kim Sen, as you can see here, he also did King Lear, but this one is multilingual, not just bilingual. Here, language is an identity marker. And this is actually a work Ong collaborated with Japanese playwright Kishida Ryo. The leader figure speaks Japanese and walks in the solemn style of no theater, while the older daughter, shown here in the center of this photo, is a composite figure of Goneril and Regan in Shakespeare, and this figure is played by a Jingju impersonator speaking Mandarin. So this arrangement draws on the Peking opera tradition of cross-gender casting on stage, right? This male actor specializes in female roles. And so it creates multiple layers of significance, not just distance to Shakespeare's original, but distance to alienate, to estrange our experience. Now, the father and daughter, they have a philosophical conversation. But that conversation is carried out in two languages and two distinct performance styles, No versus Peking opera. And that is followed by a ritualistic division of the kingdom scene. The younger sister, Cordelia, speaks Thai, although she remains silent most of the time. So Ong's Lear is set up as a corrective to the prevalent preconception about Asian languages and cultures as interchangeable. This leads us to the next topic, racial differences. So how do we hear race in film and theater? Actually, accents play a key role, and the languages they choose, the languages that director will choose to present, this is not an innocent decision. Race and ethnicity are not only visible, but also audible in the multilingual film Chicken Rice War that I mentioned at the beginning. And this film is built around the conceit of college production of Romeo and Juliet. The film uses multilingualism as both a dramatic device and a political metaphor. The elder generation converse in Cantonese, whilst the younger generation speaks mostly Singlish or Singaporean English. Fenton and Audrey, shown on this poster here, in a mix of English and Cantonese, they perform the balcony scene in which Romeo and Juliet meet after the masked ball. Meanwhile, their offstage parents become more and more impatient with their public display of affection, not understanding the boundary between playmaking and playgoing. Singapore's propaganda emphasizes commercial cosmopolitanism and transnational histories of immigration in the service of economic growth. So the film ends up critiquing the idea that sounding white, speaking standard English, conveys more authority. Let us take a look at a clip. But before I show that, in order to illustrate how this film critiques the idea of sounding white and how this film parodies not just Romeo and Juliet, but actually other famous versions, Western versions of Romeo and Juliet, we need to first take a look at the Australian director Baz Luhrmann's version called Romeo plus Juliet, because the opening scene has a TV anchor on an antiquated TV set reading Shakespeare's prologue. And after seeing that, comparing it to the opening prologue of Chicken Rice War, I'm sure you would appreciate the parallels and how the Singaporean film actually talks back to the globally well circulated film. So first, Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage.
two households, both alike in dignity.
And as you can see, the famous prologue is now repeated a second time by a male announcer with a deeper voice. And here is our Singaporean example. Let's look at how it talks back to Lerman.
Two families, both alike in dignity and profession, in fair Ang Mo Kio, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge bred to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers choose their chicken rice.
What are you saying? Do you think Mr. Tan and Ang Mo Kio can understand you? When I told you not to speak in Singlish, I didn't ask you to sound like Shakespeare. Do it again. Do it again.
Just like Lerman, the prologue here is offered a second time. This time it's actually sung in Cantonese.
Mr. Pillay, may I be so bold as to ask for a chance to read Romeo?
What makes you think that you can be Romeo?
What makes you think you can play Romeo?
You don't have the looks and you can't even speak properly. Nick, on the other hand, he looks like Leonardo DiCaprio. That's why he's Romeo. Do you think you look like Leonardo?
Yeah, I agree.
And for those of you who know Lerman, Leonardo DiCaprio at that time, not quite having his global fame as he has today, he's cast in the role of Romeo in that film by Baz Luhrmann. And so here is a direct reference, a very parodic reference to that, poking fun at global teen culture. And eventually the stage, the show, parents are invited, and yet the parents, uneducated, like the villagers in the Hong Kong film One Husband Too Many, ends up disrupting the show. Actually, their show of brawl takes over the students' show of Romeo and Juliet. So there are a lot of deep connections among these. But what do deep connections tell us? Several works that we looked at are products of meta-cinematic and meta-theatrical operations. Japanese director Akira Kurosawa used traditional theatrical elements in his film of Macbeth. His signature long shots, which remain emotionally detached, are echoed in Yukio Ninagawa stage productions. Multilingual films such as Chicken Rice War counter the narrative about universal literary experience. They compel us to work with rather than work out of the space between languages. I have noticed how subtitles can, on the one hand, erase difference. For example, we don't hear the different accents or different dialects used, right, in the English subtitles. And on the other hand, subtitles can recognize difference with an eye toward equality. There are deep connections among adaptations from different cultures. Appreciating these connections help us transcend what I call compulsory realpolitik, the conviction that the best way to understand non-Western works is by interpreting their engagement with pragmatic politics. This approach may imply that non-Western works are of interest solely because of the testimonial value. It tends to characterize a Chinese artwork based on stereotypes of its nation of origin. And that, of course, is a limiting lens. It's quite problematic. Compulsory realpolitik to imply that works from the global south are valuable only for their political message rather than their aesthetic merits. The assumption leads to research questions driven by polity For example, researchers asked, why are there so many global Shakespeare adaptations in cultures with no love for Great Britain? Obviously, you don't have to love the British government in order to appreciate Shakespeare. Anglophone Shakespeares are assumed, therefore, to have broad theoretical applicability and aesthetic merits, whereas Chinese Shakespeare, Sinophone Shakespeare, even when they focus on artistic innovation, they are compelled to prove their political worth. Critics are on the lookout for potentially subversive political messages in these works, which are compulsorily characterized as allegories of geopolitical issues. As a result, works by non-white authors are imagined to fix their intellectual content by way of a national, ethnic, or cultural location. Western white examples are assumed to be more effective in their explanatory power, to be neutral, in other words. And that is highly problematic. So I wrote this book to critique the blind spot in post-colonial studies, in Sinophone studies, but also the compulsory realpolitik tendency in scholarship. So I am happy to take questions and comments. I'm going to start my slide so that we can begin our discussion. Thank you.
I'm coming. Hi. That was super, absolutely super. I really enjoyed that talk. Catherine Temple asks immediately. She agrees with me. This is a fascinating talk. Love it. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the high culture, pop culture divide, in that an appreciation of Shakespeare is generally associated with elites in the US. How do you see that dynamic playing out in Chinese culture?
Thank you. This is an excellent question. So yes, I think especially the pandemic has revealed these blind spots in the West. The Shakespeare is automatically associated with high culture. Students see studying Shakespeare that they often confess that they find it unintelligible. It's not relevant. And yet they would drag themselves to take a Shakespeare class because they think they need it. Either they wish to become English teachers and they think Shakespeare is at the core of English studies. In many ways it is, but they also see Shakespeare as a gentleman's and gentlewoman's calling card. This is especially a phenomenon in Washington, D.C., where a lot of them are interested in the public service, right? And politicians, there's an entire history of American and British politicians quoting Shakespeare, often out of context, but never mind that. So this tendency is changing. Theater companies, they begin to put out adaptations, performances that are irreverent of Shakespeare. It's no longer someone on a pedestal to be admired, but rather a source of inspiration, a person who's given modern English a lot of the phrases that we use. So it's the divide is slowly going away. And in fact, most people and students, they come to Shakespeare not through reading an entire play, but rather a lot of those quotations out of context, memes. For example, during the early days of the COVID pandemic, it was said that, to encourage people to hang on, memes circulated. For example, Shakespeare lived through 3 plagues in his lifetime, and he wrote such great plays as King Lear, and that's supposed to be a meme to encourage people to persevere and perhaps be as productive as Shakespeare. There are some misrepresentations in that, but that's just an example of how Shakespeare actually, even in the West today, circulates in fragmentary forms, rather than in this book called Hamlet. Very few people actually encounter Shakespeare this way. They encounter Shakespeare more often through allusions. Now, in China and the Sinophone world in general, that is also the case. Of course, the different cultural dynamics in different locations, Hong Kong being a former British colony, China, which has only experienced semi-colonialism, and Taiwan with its historically closer ties to America in terms of institutional setups, such as higher education and political system. They all have different inflections on these questions. But in general, I think the dwindling divide between high culture and pop cultural illusions, that still holds. So Shakespeare has been taught in Hong Kong, in China, and Taiwan via translations. They would read the snippets of translated, highlighted passages from Hamlet, for example. So there is general familiarity with it. That is why those parodies are possible, right? Obviously, the examples I've just shown you show that the audiences are familiar enough with certain motifs in order for directors to come in and do experimental work or to parody Shakespeare. But when Chinese and Sinophone politicians, when they quote Shakespeare strictly in the sense of high culture, right? If they quote Shakespeare, it means that they assume Shakespeare is a source of moral authority. So that's quite different compared to performance culture and pop culture's uses of Shakespeare. But thank you, Catherine, for this question about the divide between high culture and pop culture.
Yes, I think that's really really interesting what you're saying. In traditional Shakespearean criticism, from at least from the Romantics onwards, and the finer the language, the finer the play was the kind of mantra. But you also found that certainly within Imperial Britain, this was the myth, the Shakespeare myth. He had to be born on St. George's Day. He had to die on St. George's Day. You got all of that kind of thing. But towards the end of the 20th century, there was a critical move against those kind of those attitudes. Shakespeare doesn't mean we mean by Shakespeare, as Terry Hawkes famously said. Would you like to comment on that kind of movement in Britain and in terms of the British way of looking at Shakespeare in relation to what you're saying? So is there some common field there?
Absolutely. I think Shakespeare is a key factor in contemporary cultural diplomacy. By cultural diplomacy, I mean the diplomatic moves that use a particular cultural figure to market the merits of a particular country. This is true in the area of tourism, but also increasingly in international affairs. In the 2012 London Olympics, we've seen very significant examples. I've already put in the chat, by the way, for all of the, I'm sorry. I'm going to put this for everyone. I'll put it again. At the London Olympics, Sir Kenneth Branagh, renowned Irish, British actor, he actually takes on the role of an industrialist to recite famous lines, "Be not a fear, this air full of noises," by Caliban from The Tempest. And I put in the chat here this clip showing his performance at the opening ceremony of London Olympics. In fact, that's not only instance. Shakespeare, either in textual quotations and in other motifs, feature very strongly, significantly, prominently at the opening and the closing ceremonies of London Olympics. Along with that, they had this whole summer long World Shakespeare Festival as a cultural Olympiad alongside with the Olympics. And so that's a primary example of Britain's recent uses of Shakespeare on the global stage. They did have quotes of Chaucer. Winston Churchill made an appearance as well, but Shakespeare remains at the very core, for better or for worse. Let me mention another very interesting example. So this is just before the pandemics, I believe, 2 to 3 years ago. China decided to build a replica village of Shakespeare's birthplace from Stratford-upon-Avon. And Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, they actually agreed to it. They signed a contract the corporation in China to authorize this. That's historic. That's the very first the first contract of this kind that was signed. And the Chinese side, they built a pavilion, which has now been installed in Stratford-upon-Avon, with quotes by the entrance, quotes from the so-called Chinese Shakespeare, the playwright Tang Xianzu, who is Shakespeare's contemporary, this peony pavilion, very often dubbed as the Chinese Romeo and Juliet, there to signal Sino-British cultural exchange and the relation that, of course, was before Trump's trade war and the increasing suspicion between UK, EU as well, and China in terms of different political cultures. But suffice to say, Shakespeare as a cultural figure has repeatedly been evoked in all these in these instances, whether it's building a replica of Shakespeare's birthplace, that little house, or this kind of a pavilion installed in Stratford-upon-Avon, whether it's a physical monument or simply intangible performances to commemorate these playwrights. The cultural figures have been appropriated for what they imagine to be politically reparative purposes, right? And that has nothing to do with the attractiveness of the contents of the plays, but perhaps rather global reputation. And the Shakespeare has already become a globally circulating icon, so powerful that the artist festivals, politicians, they can all tap into it and draw from it different ideas that they wish to project.
Yes, thank you. I might come back to some of those, but I know that Barnaby's got some questions he wanted to ask you. So I'll hand over to Barnaby for a moment. Barnaby.
Yeah, Alexia, in your book, you also discuss interpretations of Hamlet that address the role and expectations of women in society, such as in The Banquet and Prince of the Himalayas. In your view, how do other plays bring out themes that are relevant to the Sinophone world?
The question of gender, yes. Hamlet it's an interesting example. It has been quite popular in Chinese and Sinophone cultures. There are multiple adaptations. And of course, at the center is this brooding prince, but the prince's love interest, Ophelia, holds a lot of water. There's a lot of interest in, can we make Ophelia speak? And that's generally a tendency in the West today as well, in feminist adaptations. But Chinese directors, they've produced versions of Hamlet where Ophelia is assertive and yet not doesn't talk over others. So I find that really interesting. Perhaps you can call it feminism with Chinese characteristics. They simultaneously imagine her to be this ideal, perhaps Confucian woman, but at the same time holding certain, bearing the traces of cultural modernization, right? She's a modern woman, but also demonstrates traditional merits. And so in the film The Banquet, which is a martial art film by Feng Xiaogang, who's renowned throughout China, especially for his nonsensical Chinese New Year films. That's equivalent to Christmas TV shows in the West, always aired during Chinese New Year period. This is one of his more serious films, and through these martial arts films, is trying to reframe the gender relations. We have a Hamlet who's versed in swordsmanship, but he expresses masculinity in a different way, soft masculinity, if you will. That's actually a term coming out of Korean and Japanese cultural studies, in that they have singers who express themselves through androgynous presentations, and they drew a huge female fan base. They're really drawn to this kind of soft masculinity. So our Chinese Hamlet in that martial art film is soft spoken, right? he's versed in swordsmanship, but it's more a gentleman knight, right? Does not seek revenge out of rashness. And his love interest, Ophelia, interestingly, in this martial art universe, she's the only one who's not versed in any martial arts, in any swordsmanship. She sings. She's not afraid of expressing herself. Audiences are torn between. Audiences have to decide: is she too naive to behave this way in a court of intrigue, or perhaps she's simply so pure? She's a power of force of purity, and so her presence counteracts the patriarchal politics. It's up to you to decide to decide which interpretation you think is convincing. But I find a film like this very rich. They did not entirely reinvent Shakespearean gender politics. Ophelia is still oppressed, but she has more lines. She doesn't quite just talk over others. But at the same time is firm in expressing herself. And like I said, that expression perhaps is a result of purity, a result of innocence, just doesn't know how the world works. And that's why she would just talk like this. Whatever it is, I think her presence is so central to this film and so intriguing. So that's just one example of performances of gender in Chinese Sinophone cultures, how they take something very familiar and layer onto it their own understanding of gender roles today.
Any more from you, Barnaby?
Yes, you also point out in the book the false dichotomy between the native and the foreign when it comes to global Shakespeare performances, and how cross-cultural media echo one another across time. How does this affect our understanding of China and the Sinophone world today?
So what I found really intriguing is that if you study Shakespeare adaptations in India, the divide between the so-called native culture and the foreign, it's a colonial imposition, seems more clear compared to a place like China or the Sinophone world, where sometimes Shakespeare is usefully foreign for various purposes. So let me reframe that. In India, for example, Shakespeare could be seen as an icon to be resisted because it represents the colonizers, among other things. It's something that you always try to circumvent, you try to poke fun at. Shakespeare in China seems more neutral in this sense because it doesn't represent a colonizer. He's not something on a pedestal to be taken down, to be tackled, and that's why it's productive, I think, for Chinese and Sinophone artists to engage with Shakespeare, because for even though they understand very well that Shakespeare represents a form of English Renaissance art, what we really see is that they are using the so-called neutrality of Shakespeare's foreignness to reframe local politics, to reinvent local theatrical genres, to imagine new ways of making films. Like those films that I showed you, they are meta-theatrical. They're about theater making, right? So it's movies about theater making. Now, to give some example, for supporters of Taiwanese independence and Hong Kong's cause in a protest against the draconian national security law, the threat of perceived Sinicization is much more worrisome than Americanization or Anglophonization. So Shakespeare is welcome, is embraced when in particular time period, when the locals are trying to get away from any political cultural affiliation with the People's Republic of China. So that's Shakespeare's function. But throughout East Asia, you see similar moves. In Korea, for example, Japanization is a real threat for the Koreans who lived through Japanese colonization. And again, Shakespeare comes in as a neutral third party, right? He's not associated with any East Asian cultures, and it's useful in that sense. So the anxieties add distinct local flavors to the performance of Shakespeare's plays. When in India, Shakespeare is a symbol to be attacked, to be deconstructed, Shakespeare doesn't seem to occupy that kind of cultural position in China or in the Sinophone world. And as a result, I think, without that baggage, we've seen more creative engagement with this. They are having fun. When they did The Merchant of Venice, a lot of focus is on Portia, the beautiful female lawyer who masquerades under a male guise in order to go to court. Shylock is important. They understand the Jewish dilemma and all, so they are not stupid, but just the focus is different. And I think that teaches us in the West as well, these aspects about the canon that perhaps been forgotten. Othello as well. These Chinese and Sinophone audiences know full well of the racial relation, that whole history of racial relations in the West, but the directors seem less interested in the question of Blackness than Othello as a metaphor for domestic abuse. It's a domestic tragedy. So the plays speak to these audiences on different levels, not necessarily the same themes that we're used to in the West. But I think that's exactly what adaptations contribute to, open our eyes, something that's too familiar for their own good, but now, suddenly a new perspective.
Thanks.
Very good. Anything else from you, Barnaby?
Yeah, I've got a final one. Are there any significant trends or directions regarding how the language of Shakespeare, both the languages used in performance and the meanings that Shakespeare's plays evoke, is being interpreted, adapted, or transformed in Chinese?
Do you have in mind dialect, various use of multiple languages in a performance?
Yes, and with specific reference to one chapter on Divided in Our Three Kingdoms, multilingualism and diaspora, you unpack the idea that language is an unstable system of communication.
Yes, thank you for this excellent question. So in China and the Sinophone world, I think the rich linguistic landscape really needs to be acknowledged. And we see this in probably not as much in films and theater works that draw on local sources. But when it comes to adaptations of the Western classics, especially Shakespeare, you see it it becomes very obvious in terms of language role as something that fluctuates, right? Language as a signifier is not stable or fixed. They use two languages or more than three languages in order to achieve this goal, but also very often to show racial differences, to signify the theme of division, like in King Lear, like in Romeo and Juliet, because in Romeo and Juliet have two households who have been feuding supposedly for centuries. And Chinese and Sinophone directors, they would draw on linguistic difference to portray this kind of themes. Language, I think, is a key theme in our understanding of global adaptations, because people often say, something like Shakespeare is not translatable, this poetry. Partly true, but I think to advance such an argument also diminishes the achievement of his collective work, because it's far more than just words. Very often it's about ways to tell stories, so narrative patterns. It's about portrayals of particular situations, human conditions, but encapsulated in dramatic situations that carry over effectively across different cultures. So clearly the appeal and the merit, I think, in Shakespeare doesn't lie in words. So these bilingual, multilingual adaptations really open that up. And what I appreciate in their use of language, of accents, it's really it's perhaps unconscious in the beginning as you watch something, and then you slowly realize, how come certain character, whenever they appear, they always speak with this accent? Does not mean something, and then you realize it's actually connected to their particular communities, perhaps, or they deliberately, like in a Singaporean film, they use quite a bit of Mandarin, but the younger generation characters, whenever they deliberately use Singlish or even try to get rid of the Singaporean accent and just do English, as Shakespeare taught them, it's to signal the difference from the parental generation who's actually opposed to English education. And so Romeo and Juliet here becomes a platform for this kind of debate to unfold. I should say something else about that as well. So Chicken Rice War was sponsored by the Singaporean government at a time when they were trying to compete with the Korean government in terms of global influence, in terms of cultural soft power. Singapore is not renowned for producing films and television shows that circulate outside of Singapore, unlike Korea, the K-pop, the K-wave, unlike Japan. So this is one of the very first that they sponsored, and it's not innocent that they backed a project that is inspired by Shakespeare, right? But at the same time, it's the linguistic landscape in the film doesn't actually reflect the reality on the ground in Singapore, because they used they used a lot of standard Mandarin, some Cantonese, which does echo what is used in Singapore. In reality, they should have used much more Southern Min dialect, because that's actually what the Chinese communities use the most in Singapore. That and Singaporean English. But they somehow changed it to Mandarin because they had in mind of exporting this film, especially to China, to the Chinese-speaking world. So instead of having to rely so much on subtitles, they decided to ditch a locally prevalent dialect, which is not prevalent within the East Asian region. So that's really important, interesting decision to appreciate.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I know Catherine Temple has got another question. She's only up the road from you at Georgetown. I think I have to put you two in touch with each other. But she's saying, I'm interested in the implications of cultural imperialism here. Asian audiences don't necessarily develop an attachment to Western nations through absorbing Shakespeare, as you've indicated, but perhaps there is an underlying cultural impact on Asia. Do you think the adaptations undo this trend, or are perhaps speaking back to it?
I do think so. Thank you so much, Catherine. I think so. Separate. There's nothing to do with Shakespeare. English language education, right? And the global assumption that English is the lingua franca, that does have an impact on East Asia, especially China, where the language of Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, is actually among one of those with the largest number of speakers, but it never has this prestige of being a global language. And you can understand speakers of Chinese, how would they feel about something like this? So Shakespeare, being the most canonical English language writer, becomes not quite a target to be deconstructed, but it's a way for the local artists to talk back. Not only talking back, but actually to obtain tickets to international arenas. Very often they would launch adaptations of Shakespeare, particularly with international festivals in mind. Think Avignon or Edinburgh Festival, or the London Globe Theatre. They already designed the productions with touring in mind. And I think that's really significant. They will still have their particular way to engage with these classics, but it's not to show an attitude of reverence. Like here we're paying tribute to Shakespeare, but rather this is what our understanding of the most popular story in your culture is. Take it or leave it. It's our take. And some of these, like the Banquet, that's a film that has circulated very widely internationally and won some awards at festivals as well. So it's not just theater works, but actually film works sometimes. Not to mention Japan's Kurosawa, who is very canonical already in terms of Shakespearean filmmakers. In the West, typically scholars regard Kurosawa as one of the most important filmmakers of Shakespeare, even though he directed in Japanese. And I think that's the power of art in cultural exchange. In terms of this cultural imperialism in imposition of a particular language, in assuming that everyone needs an education in English. In China, for example, as reflected by multiple campuses of American and British universities. There's Nottingham in Ningbo, there's NYU in Shanghai, for example. These are all prominent outfits. And so on one hand, you have this tendency going on the other hand, in the arts, you have very creative ways of not necessarily just talking back to Shakespeare, but even talking back to the local cultures. It's simply new elements, like I said before, that are usually foreign, to allow artists to innovate, to bring 2 or 3 things together. When things are hybrid, they are at the most beautiful, flexible, at once flexible and innovative. And so something like The Banquet, One Husband Too Many, may sound Chinese, but are not quite. And I think that's the result of combining all these cultural sources to create something new.
Alexa, that's been terrific. Thank you so much. As it happens today, one of the great Shakespearean actors in England, Sir Anthony Shearer, has died. So we've just got news of that, but I'll never forget the first time he was in. I saw him in King Lear, not as Lear, but as the fool. Actually challenged conceptions of that play, and certainly he challenged conceptions of Richard III and other great plays of Shakespeare. So I thought I'd mention that in tribute to Sir Anthony, who is sadly lost. But we have had a wonderful time. I think of Shakespeare again, Sonnet 81, when he talks about meanings unseen, the things that he doesn't know are going to happen about his work. And then you've demonstrated what wonderful things happen, which are far away from any expectations that he might have had, or any expectations that people in England might have. Though I do think there was as I said before, that there have been a revolt against the kind of traditional Shakespeare as far as we can. So thank you very much indeed. Can I also thank Tong Ping and Barnaby Powell for helping us today. Thanks to our colleagues at Georgetown, Jack DeJoya, Tom Banchoff, that's the president and vice president at Blackfriars, John O'Connor, Regent, Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, Kingarunner Gabnai, our Blackfriars administrator at Campion Hall, Dr. Nick Austin, the master of the hall, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, our Campion Hall administrators. Also, thanks to Toya Woolen, Leanne Dockett there at Georgetown, and of course to Professor Catherine Temple at Georgetown. We must get, next time I'm in Washington, we must get you and Catherine together and have a good chat about all of this. It's been fantastic. My thanks also to Maggie Scott, who helped so much in what we do. The next event in this series is on Friday, the 24th of January at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. GMT, when Michelle Wang, who is from Georgetown University, will be talking about the art on the Silk Road. Look forward to that, and I hope people will join us for that. I'd like to say about 2 other events. On Thursday, 9th of December, 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. GMT, Julia Lamb, Professor Julia Lamb from Georgetown, will be talking about Julian of Norwich, in the Christian Literary Imagination series. And on Monday, December the 13th at 11 a.m. EST and 4 p.m. BST, our next free speech project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event, which is in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, we'll be discussing, will we change the climate before the climate changes us? So some good talks coming up, some before Christmas and some after Christmas. Thank you, all of you, for attending today through the Zoom. I've already had some messages from people watching on Zoom saying how much they appreciated your talk, Alexa. I'm Professor Mike Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, take care, keep safe. Thanks again, Alexa, and goodbye.
Thank you.